The patrons of Dyker's saloon reacted in shock as the body of Thomas O'Brien slumped to the floor, shot through the heart. John Boyd stood over Thomas O'Brien holding a pistol. Like everyone else in the saloon, the two men were gold miners, waiting for the last steamship south. It was December 1878, and Fort Wrangel was a lawless place in the Alaskan frontier, abandoned by the army, with no one in charge. Chaos reigned, especially when the miners were in town. With the murder of Thomas O'Brien, the people in Fort Wrangel were forced to finally answer the question, who's in charge? The answer would come with heavy consequences. Today's episode of Wrangell History Unlocked is the trial of John Boyd for the murder of Thomas O'Brien. Chapter 1. Lawlessness. While the murder of Thomas O'Brien was shocking, it may not have come as a complete surprise. Things were out of control in Fort Wrangel, and many people knew it. By 1878, Fort Wrangel was a twice-abandoned fort surrounded by a small white settlement, with a much larger, more established Tlingit village in a bay to the south. When the Reverend S. Hall Young toured the village in 1878, he remarked, "The houses were all built on the beach, which was slimy and filthy with decayed fish, meat and offal, carcasses of dead dogs, skeletons of deer and other animals, and even human bones." Fort Wrangel was the layover for the miners, not the final destination. The Cassiar Gold Rush brought thousands of miners through Fort Wrangel in the spring and summer. When winter came, the Stickeen River disgorged thousands of miners. When the Army left in 1877, the only man in Fort Wrangel with any government title was Isaac C. Dennis, the Deputy Collector of Customs. He attempted to single-handedly stop the manufacture, importation, and smuggling of liquor with a righteous zeal. Historian Roland L. Delorme describes the job like this. A pitifully small contingent of customs officers attempted to work with an equally inadequate territorial government to enforce federal laws and commercial regulations and give Alaska at least some small measure of civil peace. The collector of customs could do little about smuggling activities because of the problems of weather and distance. Such difficulties made smuggling not only profitable, but relatively safe. In early 1878, Fort Wrangel's deputy collector, Isaac C. Dennis, described an awful act of violence purveyed against an Alaska Native woman in Fort Wrangel. "A gang of rowdies and bummers have, for the past 3 months, been in the habit of getting on a drunken spree, and then at midnight going about the town, making the most hideous noises imaginable, disturbing everybody, and insulting those who do complain of these doings. On the night of February 16, the incarnate devils visited a house occupied by an Indian woman, gave her whiskey that made her beastly drunk, and then left. Shortly after their departure, the house occupied by the woman was discovered to be in flames, and ere any assistance could be rendered, the poor woman was burned to death." The Puget Sound Weekly Argus republished this account and added, "We shall wait patiently a few months longer for Congress to extend law over this region, and if our appeals are not heeded, then we shall organize a vigilante committee and take law into our own hands, let the consequences be what they may. Vigilance committees are not desirable in any country, but what other recourse have we should the present Congress refuse us aid? We must have law and order. This fact each day more fully demonstrates." Deputy Collector Isaac C. Dennis eventually lost faith in the government doing anything. He became disillusioned, resigned, and left Fort Wrangel in late 1878. Back in 1876, over 100 Fort Wrangel merchants, miners, and others signed a petition to Congress asking for the U.S. government to finally extend law to Fort Wrangel. The petitioners said the Army prevented, quote, "disorder and bloodshed," but courts of justice were necessary to protect life and property. The petition said, "Alaska Territory, including Fort Wrangel, is under military rule, but but at present no legal tribunal exists, either civil or criminal, although civil disputes and controversies are arising daily, and the want of such a tribunal is keenly felt. Instead of sending justice to Alaska, the government made things worse by withdrawing the army completely in 1877. After the army left, the Daily Alta newspaper wrote, "At Fort Wrangel there is much depression. There is no one left to settle disputes." One of the signers of the ill-fated petition to Congress was a gold miner named John Boyd. Not much is known about John Boyd. According to newspaper accounts, he was Southern and had a reputation for violent confrontations. According to the Daily Colonist, he once pulled what was called an ugly-looking knife on a man in the Cassiar. The National Police Gazette said, quote, "Very little is known of his past history, save that in Idaho he bore a bad name and was quarrelsome." A newspaper report in the 1873 Washington Standard described a stabbing affray between a man named John Boyd and William Pollard, which resulted in injuries to Boyd. Along with John Boyd, Charles Diker also signed the petition asking for law in Alaska. Charles Diker had already had his troubles with the law. 2 years before signing the petition, Diker was thrown into prison in Sitka by Major George B. Rodney for distilling alcohol. Distilleries were illegal in Alaska, but that did not stop the practice. Between August and November 1878 alone, merchants in Portland shipped 1,635 gallons of molasses to Fort Wrangel, not to mention the almost 5,000 gallons sent to Sitka. Charles Diker spent 7 months in prison, reportedly serving hard labor on a diet of bread and water, leaving his wife and young son to fend for themselves. He was released on $100 bond, but ordered to stay in Alaska. Having worn out his welcome in Sitka, Diker relocated his family to Fort Wrangel and opened a saloon. By the end of 1878, Diker's was known as a billiard saloon and a hurdy-gurdy house. John Boyd and Thomas O'Brien would cross paths in Diker's saloon. John Boyd's last days paint a picture of a man with a bad temper with plenty of targets for his rage. The story of John Boyd wound up in the National Police Gazette, recognized as the nation's first men's magazine. It describes the days before Boyd and O'Brien's encounter. On or about the 8th of December last, a dispute arose between one West and Mike Powers relative to a piece of waterfront in the town of Wrangell. This dispute led to blows, and West, being the weaker man, was frightfully beaten. Among his sympathizers was John Boyd, who openly expressed his indignation and, according to report, threatened the life of one or two of Powers' friends. Mike Powers had also signed the same petition to Congress. But something about Mike Powers upset John Boyd, so he sided with West. Said the Daily Colonist newspaper of Victoria, British Columbia, John Boyd went into the house of a cooper named McCulley to procure a piece of raw beef to put on the eye of one of the pugilists. While there he used bad language and to all intents and purposes was spoiling for a fight. Having got the piece of meat for the injured man, Boyd proceeded to Diker's saloon, where he threatened to kill any man who was a friend of Powers and commenced to abuse McCulley, said the National Police Gazette. It seems that one or two men who had become incensed at the threats made by Boyd accosted him in the saloon. A quarrel ensued. When they separated, Boyd left the saloon and, returning in a few minutes, dared anyone around to lay a hand on him now. This is the moment Thomas O'Brien enters the story. The Daily Colonist described the tense moment in Diker's saloon like this. Thomas O'Brien, who was well acquainted with Boyd, approached him in a friendly manner and asked him what ailed him, at the same time placing a hand on his shoulder and telling him that there was no occasion to call everybody he met hard names. O'Brien did not anticipate trouble with him, but directly he had given him these few words of friendly advice, Boyd drew the full-cocked pistol from the breast pocket of his coat, placed it against O'Brien's heart, fired, and killed him on the spot. In the version told by the National Police Gazette, Thomas O'Brien was drunk, took a hold of Boyd's coat and said, in the most friendly manner, "You would not hurt a friend of mine," before Boyd shot him, killing him instantly. Other writers would offer their own rationale for why Boyd shot O'Brien. "Whiskey and a woman, some say, was the cause," wrote Clarence Andrews. Reverend S. Hall Young attributed it to Boyd being full of 40-rod and jealousy. In the immediate aftermath of the death of Thomas O'Brien, the patrons of Dyker's Saloon scrambled and spread the word. As lawless and wild as Fort Wrangel was, cold-blooded murder in public view set off a wave of fear. Both victim and killer were well known, and known to each other. If Boyd could kill O'Brien with impunity, then nobody was safe. Chapter 2. Due Process. Fort Wrangel's only pastor, the Reverend S. Hall Young, was boarding a steamship for Sitka when he heard the tragic news that Thomas O'Brien lay dead, struck in the heart by John Boyd's bullet. Reverend Young debated staying in Fort Wrangel, but quickly chose to board the steamship anyway. He had important business to attend in Sitka, his own wedding. He had already missed his wedding date the month before to Fanny Kellogg, when he missed the steamship to Sitka. He wouldn't miss it again. As Reverend Young described it, he was eager to, quote, "abandon the loneliness of celibacy for the companionship of matrimony." The mortal remains of Thomas O'Brien could wait until Reverend Young got back. Fort Wrangel had no sheriff, no judges or courthouse, said the Daily Colonist. Immediately the gravity of the crime became known, the citizens of Fort Wrangel threatened to seize Boyd and lynch him. In fact, the different accounts agree that the first impulse was to immediately lynch John Boyd. The 1870s are firmly within the era of lynching as a common practice in the United States. Lynchings were an act of mob violence outside of any judicial process. Lynchings might be carried out anonymously, or they might be public spectacles. Lynching came west with settlers, and Alaska was no exception. But John Boyd would not be lynched immediately. Said the National Police Gazette, "Lynch law was then the cry, but the counsels of the less excited prevailed." Said the Reverend H.P. Courser in his History of Wrangell, "Right then and there would have been a lynching if it had not been for the bravery of Fred Lynch and one or two others. Boyd was rescued and jailed." Instead of lynching John Boyd, the miners in Fort Wrangel turned to the one man who had any government title at all, Rudolph Crittenden, the new Deputy Collector of Customs, who had hardly been in Fort Wrangel a few months. Crittenden went by Colonel Crittenden, based on his past service in the Southern Confederacy. He was 50, well-educated, and had training as a lawyer. After the Civil War, he moved out west, serving as sheriff of Fresno and serving 2 terms in the California Senate. He was almost appointed governor of Alaska, but settled for the government job of Deputy Collector of Customs. Now late in the cold wintry evening, the miners in Fort Wrangel brought Boyd before Deputy Collector Crittenden. Crittenden heard the facts and considered his role and responsibility. Crittenden declined to act at all. As he saw it, the role of Deputy Collector was limited. His job was to ensure that the government collected its duties, tariffs, and taxes. According to the Daily Colonist, Colonel Crittenden declined, stating that he had no jurisdiction in the case and informed the citizens that they were the law. In all capital letters, the National Police Gazette described Crittenden as having, quote, "no more power than a sick child." Rudolph Crittenden washed his hands of John Boyd and put the responsibility squarely with the miners. The concept of miners' law had been around a while. Mining camps were often crowded, temporary, and poorly supported by governments. Miners might self-organize committees to fight crime. In another 20 years, the last stand of Soapy Smith in Skagway, Alaska, would happen as he attempted to interrupt a miners' meeting about himself. Like lynching, miners' law was not part of the judicial process, but it existed in the minds of the people who lived it. According to the Daily Alta, before retiring for the night, the miners formed a committee and officially took charge of John Boyd. The next morning, the miners met and selected George Noel as the chair of their committee. Noel was empowered to select the judges, 3 well-respected local Fort Wrangel merchants: W.J. Stevens, I. Froman, and David Flannery. The last, Flannery, had been Fort Wrangel's deputy collector of customs from 1870 to 74, before he quit to join the gold rush. The different written accounts all agree that John Boyd was allowed to select his own defense lawyer and his own jurors. As his defense lawyer, John Boyd selected 30-year-old Scotsman, gold miner, and former Army soldier Duncan McKinnon. There is no complete account of the trial, but brief summaries remain. The trial occurred on Sunday, December 15, 1878, said the National Police Gazette. Many witnesses were examined, eliciting no testimony favorable to the prisoner, but everything conclusive of a diabolical, unjustified murder, said the Daily Colonist. Having heard the evidence, the jury retired for consultation, and after an absence of 3/4 of an hour, brought in a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The death sentence was then passed. The panel of 3 Wrangell businessmen, serving as judges, sentenced John Boyd to death. Execution was set for shortly after sunrise the next day, December 16. Chapter 3. Execution. John Boyd's last night on earth was not necessarily a quiet one, according to Reverend S. Hall Young. In my absence, they sent for Mrs. McFarland, and she visited the terrified prisoner and prayed with him as best she could. He was a coward, as such men usually are, and did nothing but beg for his life. The memory of John Boyd etched in Amanda McFarland's mind. She was brought to Fort Wrangel with stories about helping native girls and to minister to the community's Tlingit congregation. John Boyd did not exactly fit the mold of her area of interest, but Amanda McFarland took pity on him anyway. 20 years later, she recalled John Boyd's last night on earth. When murder was committed by one white man shooting another, I, being sent for 3 times during the last night by the poor, wretched man to talk and pray with him. He told me he had not heard a prayer for 20 years or longer. Such scenes as this were very trying to me, but pleasant and joyous intermingled with sad ones. The sun rose over clear skies in Fort Wrangel on Monday, December 16, at 8:18 a.m. With less than 7 hours of daylight, it was one of the shortest days of the year. For John Boyd, it would be shorter than most. An armed gang of 40 awaited John Boyd at the site of the planned hanging to ensure a peaceful execution. According to the National Police Gazette, a short while before the appointed hour, John Boyd asked for liquor and water, which were given him, and after smoking a cigar, said, "I am ready." He followed the guard with a firm step, and at 9:30 ascended the scaffold. The scaffold, erected directly in front of the scene of the murder, was roughly made, but strong and very practical, having a spring trap and a fall of 4 feet. He was perfectly resigned and cool, and being asked if he had anything to say, merely said he was sorry, and that he had not intended killing O'Brien. The noose was then adjusted, and black cap drawn over his eyes, and at a signal from the captain of the guard, John Boyd was launched into the dread eternity. He died without a struggle, without a twitch of a muscle, the fall instantly breaking his neck. But the Reverend S. Hall Young recollected a far more gruesome version of the execution of John Boyd. Said Young, "At the appointed time the prisoner was led to the rude gallows, consisting of a couple of poles and a crosspiece hastily erected. A long rope was procured and a noose placed around the prisoner's neck, and the rope was thrown over the gallows. Then every man on the beach, white or native, was compelled to take hold of the rope, and at a given signal they rushed up the beach, jerked the man in the air, and held him there until he was pronounced dead." In the days after John Boyd's execution, Reverend S. Hall Young returned to Fort Wrangel in the company of his new bride, the former Fanny Kellogg. This was the start of their new life together in Fort Wrangel. They were welcomed with this: "On my return to Wrangel, I found the duty awaiting me of burying the man who was shot, and the murderer, in one ceremony. Coffins had been crudely constructed, and those who remained at Fort Wrangel all turned out for the funeral." Reverend Young reports that he and Deputy Collector Crittenden sent the court proceedings by steamship to the U.S. District Court Judge out of Portland, Oregon, Matthew Deedy. Young recalled the judge's reply, praising the work of the miners. The judge said, "The miners of the North can always be depended upon to do the right thing in a case like that, and to do it speedily. It would be well if our organized courts were as prompt and as just." 9 years before, the first execution in Alaska under the United States also happened in December, by hanging, in Fort Wrangel, in full view of the entire Tlingit village. The prisoner was Scott Dew, a Tlingit man who shot and killed traitor Leon Smith as retribution for the Army's shooting death of Scott Dew's sons. It brought an end to the event known as the Bombardment of Wrangell. Of the 12 executions in the history of Alaska under the United States, the first 2 were in Fort Wrangel, the second being John Boyd. Chapter 4. Life Goes On. The long December of 1878 came to an end when the steamship finally arrived, taking the huddled masses of gold miners south to homes far away. They carried with them the incredible story of a murder, trial, and execution in the lawless frontier. Newspapers around the country ran a brief clipping about the story of crime and punishment in faraway Alaska. John Boyd was national news. Most of the people named in the story moved on, seeking fortune elsewhere, never to return to Fort Wrangel. Charles Diker and his wife and son went back to Sitka, running a meat market on Lincoln Street. When Charles Diker died, the locals of Sitka took up a collection to care for his wife, who could not care for herself. Some of the names mentioned in the story, Fred Lynch, Duncan McKinnon, and Rudolph Crittenden, were new to Fort Wrangel, but they stuck around. They became Fort Wrangel's business and civic leaders, taking control of Fort Wrangel's destiny. Each of them has a street named for them in Wrangell today. Each one aged into a Wrangell old-timer, with a story to tell the young ones about the lesson of John Boyd and Thomas O'Brien. Was John Boyd lynched, or did he receive justice? Klaus M. Naske and Herman E. Slotnick, writing in Alaska, a History, call this the region's first lynching. For the people in Fort Wrangell who witnessed the tragedy unfold, it was the fulfillment of their darkest fears. A line from the petition signed by John Boyd, Charles Diker, Mike Powers, and scores of other Fort Wrangell men predicted this type of event and the outcome it would force. It read, "Such want of law is also calculated to tempt those who conceive that they have grievances to take the law into their own hands and convert might into right." Wrangell History Unlocked is written and produced by Ronan Rooney. Music from today's episode by Mary Rooney.